joint map societies. I hope most of you have been able to get your vaccination shots by now. And I think we are all looking forward to doing a few more things in person. But I think in terms of these virtual Zoom meetings, it's our intention to continue through June and probably into the fall as well. Okay, my name is Ronald Grimm. I'm the Vice President and Program Chair of the Washington Map Society. Welcome to this evening's program, which is hosted by a partnership of 8 map societies representing all parts of the country: Boston, California, Chicago, New York, Rocky Mountains, Texas, and Washington Map Societies, as well as the Library of Congress's Philip Lee Phillips Society. These map societies are nonprofit organizations that support map collecting, cartography, and the study of cartographic history. Groups also supply financial support for this Zoom meeting. If you are not a member, we hope you will consider joining at least one map society. And as soon as I finish talking, I will put a message with the links for each map society website in the chat. Benefits for each society vary. For example, members of the Washington Map Society receive 3 annual issues of the Portland Journal and digital access to all past issues and digital access to guest lecture videos. If you are not a member, the Washington Map Society has an introductory rate of $25 for the first year of digital membership. And we would invite all of you to stay tuned to the Washington Map Society website because we're going to launch our new website next week. We and our partner map societies would like to thank our advertisers who support our groups and also help make possible the publication of our journals. The Portland and Calafia, the Journal of the California Map Society. Before we proceed further with tonight's program, here are several requests for this Zoom presentation. As we've said many times before, please mute your microphone during the lectures and wait until the question and answer period at the end to ask questions. You can use the chat feature to type questions. Please note that this lecture will be recorded, so please turn off your video and microphone if you do not want to be recorded. After the question and answer period, we will leave the meeting open for a few minutes for attendees to socialize if they wish, at which point you may turn your microphone back on. With the assistance of our partner map societies, we have scheduled monthly Zoom meetings through June of 2021. These programs are listed on the Washington Map Society and other society websites. They also appear in the most recent issue of the Portland. As I've indicated, the Washington Map Society has decided not to schedule any meetings during the months of July and August, but we will resume a monthly schedule of Zoom meetings starting in September through at least December. Our next meeting is scheduled for Monday evening, May 17, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. It will feature Matthew Gilmore, a Washington, D.C. author, columnist, speaker, and blogger. And the title of his presentation is Tilting Washington's National Mall. Well, it's it's focusing on Washington, D.C. We think it's at least talking about a feature that is common and known to everybody across the country. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Curtis Wright, president of the Chicago Map Society, and he will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Ron. Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend and fellow Chicago Map Society board member, Jim Ackerman, as tonight's presenter. But before we begin, on behalf of CMS, I just want to say thanks again to all of the various participating map societies who have come together to offer a great variety of digital programming. I know our membership has really enjoyed the variety, and we appreciate the opportunity to join you all tonight. After a career at the Newberry Library that first began in 1985, Jim is now the curator of maps and director of the Herman Dunlap Smith Center for the History of Cartography at the Newberry. He also serves as a trustee of the International Society for the History of the Map, a member of the board of directors for Imago Mundi, and a member of the boards of review for the Osher Map Library and the Leventhal Map and Education Center. In addition to directing summer seminars, working with the litany of aforementioned organizations, and creating online and in-person exhibitions, Jim has written and edited an extensive list of publications relating to maps and cartography. I know that 20th century travel material is one of his foremost interests, along with board games and baseball, and thus am doubly exciting for this evening's presentation. To reiterate the reminder from earlier, please be cognizant of your audio and video settings, and please feel free to use the chat window to submit any questions for after the presentation. And with that, I'd like to formally hand things over to tonight's speaker, Jim Ackerman.
Thank you, Curtis. I will enable the share screen so you can see my PowerPoint. And then I will, if I can get the menu out of the way, I'll turn on the slideshow. Okay. I trust that everyone can hear me. I can't see you, so we'll have to just go on trust.
Here you will.
Okay, thank you all for inviting me. Thank you, Curtis, for the kind introduction, and Ron for making the invitation almost a year ago, I think, for me to come talk on this subject. Curtis is absolutely right. This has been something that's been central to my interests forever. I am a chronic collector of road maps and travel ephemera, both in a personal and professional capacity. And I wanted to start by telling a little story. Some years ago, I was invited to talk at the Denver Public Library in an event, I think, jointly sponsored by the Rocky Mountain Map Society. And I was actually talking about ephemeral cartography in part, or road mapping in general. And I did a little exercise from the time I flew from Chicago to Denver, I collected examples of maps that I found along the way. So the first map that I got, I guess I can ignore the very poor map on the back of the United Airlines magazine. But when I got to the rental agency, I picked up a rental car map from Alamo. I gotta remember to do this. There was these ubiquitous brochures stacked in the route by the entrance to the rental car dealership. I resisted the temptation to pick up each and every map in this group. When I got to the hotel, I asked if I could if they could point me to a restaurant. And they gave me this nice little, very schematic map of nearby restaurants. So these are all examples of what we can call. Please mute. These are all examples of maps that one can find rather casually, even in the digital age. I call them travel ephemera, or I put them under the general category of road map and travel ephemera. And for the past several decades, the Newberry has been collecting and processing travel brochures, advertising tourist attractions, points of interest, and other localities of potential interest to leisure travelers. travelers. We estimate, and I think this is a low estimate, that we have about 100,000 in what we call our road map and travel collection. And as part of a much larger collection, which also includes this material, of at least 250,000 road maps and travel brochures, but I think the numbers, again, are probably low. To be honest, we don't really know how many we have. These come in almost endless varieties and formats, from small and simply bound booklets to large single sheets that have been folded several times to a portable size. Most are printed in color and combined in various amounts, blocks of text, images, photographs, and maps. The term ephemera is Greek in origin, meaning around or about in a day. Literally, Maurice Ricard tells us, it refers to something that lasts through the day, which is the case of some winged insects. The original term then referred to temporary, short-lived things or phenomena. With regard to printed ephemera, Ricard characterizes printed ephemera as transient documents of everyday life that were generally expected to be discarded. Though, as we have seen, some types of ephemera were meant from the start to be collected and kept. The attraction of ephemera to modern collectors lies in their fragility, their vulnerability, the very improbability of their survival. For collectors, ephemera is normally taken to refer to paper objects, and more specifically printed matter of a limited size and mercurial in its use. Its cultural and social presence certainly preceded the 19th century and the 20th century, but we experienced explosive growth in this kind of material in the late 19th and 20th century with the parallel emergence of maps consumer culture. Few map scholars have paid much attention to these objects, and there exists a methodological void to address them. Ideally, since we're talking largely about the materiality of these objects, we should be looking at them together and in person without the mediation of PowerPoint, but under the circumstances, we have no choice. This talk will consider in turn 4 areas, not 3 as I originally stated in my abstract: the physical relationship of a map or other maps or maps to other elements of the brochure, a typology of different types of maps, an overview of the authors and sponsors of these maps, and then we will conclude with a few examples of how maps and other elements together contribute to our interpretation of these objects. Examples of cartographic ephemera, be they products of a corporate entity or some local an unknown designer or author, are quirky and distinctive, often narrow of purpose, even seem divergent from the cartographic mainstream, or the cartographic ideal, as Matthew Edney calls it. Their very survival, again, it reflects their importance as souvenirs to their first owners. Is it, for example, sentiment or design that has attracted me to the placemat here advertising a supper club on Green Lake in Wisconsin? Or is it the fact that this is a place that my wife and I dined for our honeymoon on Green Lake, Wisconsin in 1983? Each of these maps are in their own way elegant, even inspired pieces of cartographic design, but it is the transient nature that makes them so compelling. As a scholar, the types and formats of these maps are almost unlimited, and their numbers are prodigious. Even in the digital age, these modest maps on paper are almost everywhere, and they have a prominent but largely unrecognized and unstudied part of cartographic communication since at least the mid-19th century. As a scholar working in the Research Library of Environment, I have come to understand that ephemeral maps, like Ephemeral in general, struggled for a place among the established classes of formats: books, prints, manuscripts, archives, broadsheets, pamphlets, and yes, maps among them, that professional librarians use in catalog descriptions and finding aids. It is hard in practice to draw a line between the draw a clear line, drawing the boundary between a map and a brochure as formats. And I've come to the conclusion that perhaps it's best not to try. That said, maps, no matter how small, embedded in these brochures, really deserve to be taken in their own context and in their own right as cartographic projects. The simple map attached to this mid-20th century promotional brochure for Ramada Inn in Watertown, New York, serves its purpose in directing travelers from Interstate 81 to the hotel's location off of State Route 3. It perhaps made little sense for the chain or franchisee to engage a professional cartographer to create a map that almost anyone with a sense of direction and a minimum of graphic skill could execute. Moreover, the sparseness of the representation serves the inn very well. The map serves in all geographical details lacks in all geographical details except for the relative location of the inn in respect to two intersecting highways, and it is particularly well suited to the practice of superhighway travel, since navigation of the countryside beyond the immediate environment of the interstate is often neither required nor encouraged, lest one finds a better place to stay or eat. On the other hand, there is room for virtuosity among these ephemeral promotional maps. A 1946 brochure published by the Port Authority of New York is a small masterpiece, in my opinion, of graphic design and persuasion. It advertises 3 connections across the Hudson River that the authority owns and operates: the George Washington Bridge, the Holland Tunnel, and the Lincoln Tunnel. It also captures the moment when planners' embrace of the automobile infrastructure went largely unchecked. The mid-century modern design aesthetic emphasizes the speed and ease with which, via these new constructions, motorists could enter or exit chronically congested Manhattan. And by implication, this ties the Port Authority to modernist lifestyles and aesthetics. Also, what the traditional categories wouldn't serve well this map advertising the mighty Mississippi. The map itself occupies only roughly 1/6 the entire sheet of paper, and traditionally it might not have been cataloged as a map. This would do the quality of the execution of the map itself disservice, but more importantly, it does disservice to the intimate relationship that the map has with the surrounding elements of the publication. So let's delve into these. First, we're going to be looking at formal matters, starting with Recto and Verso. Traditionally, this official state highway map of Michigan would be cataloged as a map, but I argue that what is on the reverse side of the map is just as important, as this series of editions of the map from the late 1930s to 1950s show. On the back side of the map changes with every year, and for a period of time in the late 1930s, with every season, had both winter and summer editions that were published by the state of Michigan. During the Second World War, the backside of the map advertises specifically Detroit's contribution to the war effort. And in the 1950s, it advertises the state's undertaking of new highway construction, all on the backside of the map, while the front side of the map remained virtually identical. This practice of making full use of the backside of the map is something that is traceable to the mechanization of printing techniques during the mid-19th century, which made it far more easier than it had been in the copperplate era to print quickly on both sides of a particular sheet of paper. Already in the 1870s, when George Crofut produced maps for his popular transcontinental tourist guide, we find that he was not above printing advertisements as a way of financing his publication on the backside of his fold-out maps, such as this map of Salt Lake City, or this map of showing the global situation of the Transcontinental Railroad, which has these wonderful illustrations and advertisements on its backside. Something quite comparable is found all over cartographic ephemera published in the 20th century, such as this map produced by an advertising agency in 1967, which has a remarkable pictorial map panorama on one side, and then fully occupied with paying advertisers on the front. I'm sorry, on the back. So coming back to questions of formality, what are we looking at? Are we a map? Well, a map brochure like this, of course, challenges our concept of what a map is. Certainly with this pictorial panorama of the World's Fair in Seattle in 1962, we are looking at least at a map-like object. There is a much more conventional map here in this brochure of Rock City. But of course, the map here is mostly meant to help people find Rock City in case those signs that are all over the interstate highway didn't help you. But I want to draw your attention to the little map that's actually barely noticed on here on the bottom sheet, which is a little set of footprints that show these marvelous little gnomes going about Rock City, which are taking you from one site to another. So these brochures are, even as they are using very small maps, are also experimenting very dramatically with different types of forms of cartographic expression. Now, the association of maps with books, of course, it goes back to early modern times, but becomes much more pointed in the 19th century in the context of travel guides, in which fold-out maps were often paired with navigational information, as in this very early Traveler's Guide by John Mellish, or in broadsides such as this one produced for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, which advertised the actual location, the location of the railroad's land grant, and promotes the land that it was selling in very flowery language and accompanying text. A much more polished example of this combination of map and text is from this very early map advertising Yellowstone National Park published by the Northern Pacific Railroad. On one side is a very good map of the Yellowstone Park. On the other side is this marvelous travelogue called Alice's New Adventures in the New Wonderland, which notably this was published only about 15 years after the first editions of Alice Through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland were published. And the text of this backside is presented as a letter by Alice back home to her sister Edith, praising the characteristics and comforts of the Northern Pacific Railroad, and it's the many sights that you can see along the way. And as you turn, actually, if we go back a couple things, you actually have to rotate. I hope you can see on your right that you actually have to turn the recto of the map in order to get to these panels. This is a technique that we know very well from railroad timetables that often combined a map with a reverse that includes, it's presented in a series of panels which fold out like in accordion style, like a book, which include the timetables and often descriptive information as well. And it carried over into the 20th century in publications such as this map promoting, or brochure, choose whichever term you want, promoting the Appalachian Scenic Highway, published in 1929, which combines a series of sectional maps of different sections of this highway with images and descriptions of the subscribing hotels that paid for the promotion of this highway and the publication of this map. The linear format of things like the Mormon Pioneer National Historic Trail from much later in the 20th century lends itself to this treatment of front and back map and text. On the front is a map of the entire historic trail, and on the back side is a narrative history of the Mormon Trail, which also takes you along the particular route. In some cases, we should be thinking about these maps in a slightly different way, as if they are little atlases. So here is a rather modest tour guide, Frederick County, Maryland from 1978, which includes no less than 3 maps that, starting in the upper right, look at the actually 4 maps, starting in the lower right, a map situating it in Maryland, then a map that shows a slightly lower context above that, a regional map of the entire county, and finally a map of the city itself. Something that the format of the brochure handles very well. Another example from the Valley, published by Valley National Bank in Phoenix, Arizona. On one side is a standard Randick Valley street map of Phoenix. On the other side is a map of Arizona and a lavish pictorial map of the Valley of the Sun, the greater Valley of the Sun. In some cases, these brochures really truly are atlases, such as this example of a early 1923 tourist guide, please read, and which includes some regional maps alongside advertisements. This beautiful brochure promoting the Florida East Coast Railway with wonderful Art Deco graphics, suitable to Florida, of course, with wonderful regional maps that are situated in description of the different places, its major stops along the Florida East Coast Railway. And from the later mid-century, an equally striking map of the Northwest for Northwest Orient or Airlines back in the time when airlines issued maps to their passengers, which truly is a little atlas that you can follow along as you were traveling from coast to coast, or indeed perhaps all the way across the Pacific Ocean to Japan. A second way of slicing through this material is by looking at map types. And I've identified 5, which are certainly overlapping, but which have some salient characteristics. The first is the iconic or logographic. Sorry, my telephone is ringing. Hopefully my wife will answer it. There she goes. Okay, so the first of these is one example occupies 2 panels of folded 8-panel brown monochrome brochure, and it's titled "Welcome to Mount Vernon, Illinois, Gateway to the Recreation Wonderland of Mid-America." Here, a large dot places Mount Vernon at the center of southern Illinois with a rudimentary outline of the state. The map locates the city at the nexus of 5 lines radiating to pictorial vignettes representing recreational opportunities that can be pursued in the vicinity of Mount Vernon, namely golf, camping, hunting, boating, and fishing. Though arrayed on the map in a specific direction from Mount Vernon, these activities have no concrete geographical reference. Golf is not located on one side of the city and camping another. So in this sense, this map, at least on the right, is meant to be map-like, an abstraction that is meant to represent the location iconographically. A similar one for the Finger Lakes region shows, I hope you can see this in receding in the background, an image of grapes. This is a thing that's published during the Fall Harvest Festival when people are flocking to upstate New York to promote to see grapes. And we've always seen this iconographic representation of the Mississippi River in that mighty Mississippi brochure that we saw earlier. The second type is the directional maps, maps that are somewhat single-mindedly, at least in the first instance, to get you located, to get you to one particular location. We've already seen a couple examples of this. Here is another one from Watertown, New York. I guess I just found these together in the folder, which is meant to direct you to this motel location, a Holiday Inn in this case. Here's one for on the left, the Good and Plenty restaurant in the Amish country near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This uses an interesting technique. People might not have normally have left Route 30 in order to get to this particular restaurant, but they might have been leaving Route 30 to get to the Hershey Farm or the famous farmers market in Bird in Hand. And the restaurant wants you to know that it's conveniently located to these two top-notch tourist attractions. Another wonderful example, less schematic, is this a plain black and white street map of Great Falls, Montana, that doubles as a placemat. It offers a perfectly serviceable street map of the city, embellished only by an illustration of the sponsoring establishments, the conjoined Midtown Motel and Smitty's Pancake House, and a prominent line right here draws the reader's eye from the drawing of the striking mid-century modern structure at lower right to the motel and restaurant's location at the center of the city. From the 1920s to the 1940s, road maps published by Rand McNally, the AAA, or one of their competitors, produced similar but more polished maps placing a hotel within the highway network of its region. I call these all roads lead to maps. Here is an example for the Waldo Hotel. Often inner city hotels that are feeling bypassed by the emerging automobile culture use this kind of device to draw people into their accommodations. This is one produced by a small hotel chain based with two hotels, one in Rock Island, Illinois, and one in South Bend, which has a map that directs you to the hotels and is centered on Chicago, which is roughly equidistant between these two particular locations. Yet another type is the populated map, which is exemplifies by a couple of unsighted maps here. Here's an example produced by the Hudson River Valley Association, which fills one side of this brochure when it is unfolded with a list of with a map. The map identifies particular sites of interest located with numerals circled and indicated in green circles, which then are described in greater detail on the margins and on the back side of the map. Rand McNally and other standard publishers made the use of this kind of populated map to promote all manner of businesses. We know about oil company maps, of course, but here is an example promoting the Richmond Brothers Clothier or the Gold Clothes Shop, which is located, had a number of locations throughout the upper Great Lakes states and upstate New York. Here's a map for Howard Johnson's, which by the way, tells you also the number of ice cream flavors that you can find at these locations. One of my favorites is this wonderful map of center of the city of Duluth. Rather crude aesthetics, I guess you'd say in some respects. I think it's a masterpiece of design in the way that it's got subscribing businesses to be identified on these balloons that surround the map and then are drawn with red arrows and carefully using red so as it'll stand in distinction with the grid of streets underneath, locating each one of these businesses on the map. And on the backside, they're doing the same for a detailed map of the center of the city. Yet another type is the tour or itinerary map, which is organized to take people on particular gauge tours. This became very popular in the automobile era since automobilists, motorists had a large amount of range of possibilities, and advertisers and local chambers of commerce and other kinds of groups like this were looking for ways to draw them and their dollars to particular to a whole set of attractions or locations. Often these have historical themes, and as in the case of this Lincoln Heritage Trail. Here is one produced by the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, which organizes sites along what it calls the Conquistadores Trail. Here is one published by the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, which arrays everything around the greater vicinity of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. So you might have some reason to cross the Chesapeake Bay, not once, but twice, in order to make a circuit around the greater lower Chesapeake. And one of my favorites of all time of this genre is a Burger King map to historic Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which has a guided tour that gets you keys to locations to various businesses in the area, but every fourth business seems to be the location of a Burger King restaurant. Walking tours were also popular. Development out of this technique. Here is one for Springfield, Illinois. There is both a motoring tour of the land of Lincoln and then a walking tour of the central part of the city, which has these very large footsteps that direct you. They're large enough to be Abe Lincoln's footsteps, by golly, and they're taking you to the various sites that follow you in the paths of Abe Lincoln. Similar one to take you along historic houses in Natchez, Mississippi. And finally, the pictorial maps. These are maps that we've all gotten to know a little bit better in the greater history of cartography community because of their tremendous interest to map collectors, because of their great beauty. These include some very polished maps by trained artists and commercial artists, including maps that were done for airlines. But there are also more vernacular ones and fairly modest ones. Here's a wonderful small panorama of downtown Memphis that was produced for the convention by the Convention and Tourism Bureau, and apparently was customized for a particular convention that was meeting there, the American Society of Certified Public Accountants in 1931. Something on the order, something more prosaic. You note that I'm obsessed with these Amish locations as well. Here's one for something called the Hex Highway, which uses simple logographic pictorial representations of different of barns and covered bridges and horses and buggies to give some sense of the character of the relationship. A third way to slice through this data is through the sponsors, the people that are responsible for creating this material. There are individual sponsors. Now we know some of these individual sponsors are large corporations through the oil companies that we are very familiar with. But these include such businesses as as rent-car businesses, which, by the way, even in the age of digital, even in the digital age, still offer paper maps. They don't hand them out to you, at least in my recent experience. You have to ask for them from the agent when you pick up the car, but I, of course, never fail to do so, as I'm always anxious to add to the Newberry's collection. This also includes railroads, which well into the 20th century are producing glossy brochures to promote as a form of competition, to promote in competition with the automobile, to promote the comforts and scenic opportunities of riding on the railroad. Here's one by the New York Central promoting the Hudson River. Hotel chains produced a number of very functional maps or little atlases, which are directories. I'm sure all of you have used these from time to time. This is one for Days Inn in 1983, making use of a technique that Tufte would have called small multiples, where these nearly identical types of maps are strewed throughout the exhibit to have these very simple directional maps that give you a location of these Days Inn restaurants. And usually there's a general populated map as well in these little atlases that shows the locations in a larger geographical context. But often it was very important for specific smaller businesses to do this. This include inns and hotels such as Longfellow's Wayside Inn in South Sudbury, Massachusetts. This is from the 1970s. In some cases, things like bicycle rentals, where that previous map we were looking at is a simple directional map. This is a handout that is really capitalizing on the need for a map of Mackinac Island. If you've never been to Mackinac Island, you would know that outside of horseback or walking or horse and buggy, the only way you can get around the island is by bicycle. And so Reba's bicycle rentals, which seems to have a monopoly on the island, is more than happy to give you a very functional map of the bicycle routes. Back in the time when all banks in the country weren't owned by 4 or 5 mega bank organizations, local banks found it very important to produce maps that they offered their customers as a way of luring new customers, giving them information as they're coming into the area for the first time, and as a service that would guarantee customer loyalty. For similar reasons, real estate companies would issue maps as a way of obviously providing information for people who are renting an area and considering buying property. But the largest group of these maps, and perhaps for me at least, as not for many of you, are maps that are produced for roadside attractions, brochures produced by roadside attractions. Sometimes these are attractions that capitalize on existing natural wonders, such as Sable Chasm, or they're fairly contrived ones, such as the Trees of Mystery in Klamath, California, the Shrine of the Redwood Highway, where you can drive through a tree and see sculptures made out of recently felled redwoods, and while you're at it, go across the street to the restaurant, which the organization, and you better do it, by the way, because this is in a pretty sparsely populated area in Northern California. Here is a particularly battered example promoting Nameless Cave in the Black Hills region of South Dakota. Another popular group are consortial sponsors. These include regional maps, which are produced by groups such as the Southeastern Tourist and Publicity Association. Individual restaurants and organizations would band together and try to develop a regional identification, a regional cultural identification for their area. In this case, they're not above using a little 1920s version of cheesecake in the way of selling this region. We've got countless maps of wine regions. The granddaddy of them all, the wine region of Central California, but these are to be found any place where the warming climate is now developing the wine industry, such as Georgia, northern Michigan, traditional areas of upstate New York. These guided tour maps of particular regions. Similar phenomenon is covered bridge trails that you find any place where covered bridges are to be found, such as the Upland South, northern Georgia. I want to pause for a little bit on this particular example because often these consortia are the creations of individual publishers. In this case, we're looking at the Custer Battlefield Parkway, which is produced by, this is the brainchild of W.D. Fisher, a businessman in Sheridan, Wyoming, who traveled extensively and aggressively solicited the support of state officials in Iowa, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana to finance the improvement of marking this route, which he called the Custer Battlefield Parkway, and then produced a folded brochure, which includes, of course, all sorts of advertisements by subscribing hotels, garages, and other businesses. A variation on this is the strip highway map, such as this, promoting the old Tixie Highway, which ultimately became US 25, which was a small strip map that could be very easily produced, and you can see in the lower right could be customized and put on the desk of, in this case, Shelby Motel, as a way of advertising other businesses that would be found along this route. And something I call the not so deep state. Federal agencies such as the Department of Natural Resources. This is a map of Horicon Marsh in south central Wisconsin. Dams are common tourist attractions. Here's from 1948, a map of the Fort Peck Dam in Montana. Chambers of Commerce, semi-governmental organizations. Here's one produced by the Denver Convention and Visitors Bureau, which also defines on the inside of the brochure a series of day trips that you could take out of Denver. Here's a map in Santa Clara County, California, which promotes this as an industrializing county and identifies the locations of industrial sites. So for a different type of tourist, the business traveler. In the East, we often find these very scholarly maps that document cultural and historical interests. This is one from Middlesex County, New Jersey, and it is, you can see, organized by the Cultural and Historic Heritage Commission of the county. But you see that they're not just advertising cultural sites, but also particular businesses in the area. Some of these are fairly prosaic. Here's a very cheap map of Gallia County in the far southern part of Indiana, which is financed in part by subscribing businesses, although it's published by the Visitors Bureau. Here is a somewhat more colorful one of London, of Laurel County in south central Kentucky, which has the distinction of being the location of the very first Colonel Sanders restaurant. In some cases, we have professional marketers that make a business out of developing these kinds of maps. In other words, they have a business model that they bring to advertisers, and of course, one of the best that they bring to advertising businesses. We know this from Rand McNally being one of the most famous progenitors of this kind of model. There is a company called was a company called the Travel Map Corporation that marketed strip maps that took the form of placemats that could be put on restaurants and diners all along that highway. We have a little atlas that actually assembles all of these, and I think there's something like 60 of them in all. You've probably seen a variation of this, a panoramic map of a central city where there are some well-known landmarks that don't have to pay to be included. In the case of Seattle, this might be the Space Needle, which is shown on the lower left on the pictorial map, but all the other locations, or virtually all the other locations on the map, are businesses that had paid for being included on this panoramic map. And then I want to point out that there are hundreds of somewhat nameless people that are the intermediaries of these, and we need to pay a lot more of attention, especially to these groups, especially if we are interested in charting the whole creation of this phenomenon as a kind of mapping process. So printers, lithographers, commercial artists, county surveyors, and all manner of advertising agencies who often appear as on the small print of these maps, but I'm trying to take much more notice of these. And ultimately, it's people. It's people like this gentleman, Ray Walker, who produced sort of a one-man AAA, who in the 1930s produced these magnificent compilations of cabin trails maps, quite glossy, quite well-produced maps. I think they were produced with the assistance of the General Drafting Company. I may forget, but he basically had listings of subscribing hotels, but he guaranteed the quality of these motels. This went right up until 1939. It seems to have died down during the war. Or maps that are brochures that are works of passionate obsession, such as this key guide to Route 1 heading down to Key West from Key Largo, which makes note of the flora and fauna along the way. And then there's this guy who's produced what is a very perfectly serviceable map. Hasn't signed his work, but perhaps he or she are the owners of the Viewmount Motel in Whitefish, Montana, and they think this map was perfectly serviceable. They ran it off on a mimeograph machine, and voila, we have a fine map. Okay, I hope I haven't run too long on time. I would like to close by just considering offering some thoughts why these things are important. These materials offer a compelling resource for cultural and social historians, art historians, historical geographers, and historians of travel and travel literature. Their lack of polish, implicit biases, and rhetorical flourishes, their combined engagement of text, map, and image, and their targeted navigational utility are the very qualities that define their appeal to scholars in these fields, especially those researching the cultural history and historical geography of the hyper-commercialized landscape of motorized space created by and for the American car culture. We find this in the way that the American car culture was almost obsessed with traditional and Amish landscapes that fairly invited traversing by car. We find this in the way that a map published by the Chesapeake Bay Bridge and Tunnel explains how new infrastructure, including interstate highways and toll bridges, allow within the space of a week travelers to travel back in time to purportedly genuine but commercialized landscapes and sites representing familiar narratives of the American Revolution across the greater Chesapeake region, or follow the goals to peaceable natural landscapes and semi-wildernesses. And we find this in the way that maps of wine regions fuel the economic transformation of rural landscapes, supporting a new economy created by and for automobility. Ephemeral and travel mapping also bears witness to the social transformation of the American landscape in this period. One of the more compelling examples is a 1927 highway map of North Dakota published by the Greater North Dakota Association. It is typical of the often crudely produced maps issued by chambers of commerce and consortial organizations early in the automobile era, when paved highways were not yet the norm in many parts of the United States. The bold black lines on the map show the few highways that have been paved, while dashed lines indicating improved roads promise pavement yet to come. The Indian Wars on the Northern Plains were recent memory in 1927 for whites and native inhabitants alike of North Dakota. North Dakota had chosen the head of an Indian in profile as its icon. You can see that on the map in the right center, as its icon for roadside marking of state route markers. And the text on the map's front cover asserts that it is Red Tomahawk, the Sioux Indian chief who killed Sitting Bull at Grand River, South Dakota during the ghost dance outbreak of December 15th, 1890. On one panel, a large advertisement for the Valley Hotel Cafe suggests that the map was primarily intended for tourists or other travelers passing through the state. Yet on the reverse of the map, at lower right, text in a small cartouche seeks new settlers. Prospective home seekers should visit North Dakota, a great agricultural state, and offering an extended invitation to farmers to motor into North Dakota to look at their land. Very similar to the kinds of appeals that railroad companies made 40 and 50 years before. A roughly contemporary but far more polished map and brochure published in 1930 documents an early stage in the motor age transformation in metropolitan America, in this case in Greater Philadelphia. Prepared by Franklin and Company engineers and copyrighted by Donovan Armstrong, a local advertising agency, the map represents the interests of the Associated Merchants of the Garrett Roads. Located at the intersection of Garrett Road and the main western route from central Philadelphia, Market Street, as it becomes the Westchester Pike, modern Pennsylvania Route 3. The Garrett Roads merchants were in the midst of branding what was in effect an early automobile-oriented shopping district and the commercial hub of suburban Upper Darby. The location was and is still a major junction of commuter light and heavy rail lines, a fact that the dashed red and white lines on the brochure's primary map clearly indicates. But the map's title, Road Map of Main Highways and Certain Highway Maps, advertises its convenience, and it makes favorable comparisons of the Garrett roads to the city center of Philadelphia, which can be easily reached, but which doesn't have nearly as much parking as can be found in the Garrett roads. And the text here emphasizes this. We also find some virtuosic maps, such as this map by the famous illustrator Charles Owens, produced for motor tourists in 1936, but which has to be contrasted with the warning that's that found on the map itself, that while attractions for tourists are unlimited in California, it is necessary to advise persons seeking employment not to come here at this time. When opportunity arises, California will gladly make it known. So this map is published at the very moment that John Steinbeck is doing his research for the Grapes of Wrath. And how can we not look with the current situation at the border, southwestern border of the United States? How can we not look somewhat wistfully at these mid-20th century maps published by authorities associated with border cities such as Nogales and Santa Cruz County that emphasizes their ties to Mexican culture and the ease of crossing the border. Laredo, which was a major migration route and still is a major migration route and the crossing point of the Pan American Highway, operated something which was called the Border Olympics in the early part of the 20th century, and it's promoted in this brochure. And this map of El Paso and Juarez, which is annotated in this case, which has as much detail about Juarez as it does about El Paso. And indeed, the annotator has marked the location of a particular shop that they want to visit in Juarez. And in final closing, and without leaving the topic of map annotation, I want to dwell on this map. This is a map, the street map of Huntsville, Alabama, prepared by the Dolph Map Company for a multi-list real estate company, published in the 1960s, early 1960s. Pencil annotations on the outer cover identify the location of 3 pizza parlors and suggest that the map was actually used by out-of-town visitors, presumably shopping for a new home. Inked circles on the map itself probably indicate neighborhoods that the real estate agent has targeted for them. And keyed numbers identify the locations of schools, a key concern for most home buyers in any era. But reading from this key, we learned that one of the target areas included both an elementary school and a junior high school. The key also identifies which schools are colored in the segregated city, which was then as now home to important facilities in the American space program. None of these colored schools laid within the 2 circles drawn on the map. We cannot be certain of the race of the prospective buyers or indeed whether race came up at all in the consideration of prospective neighborhoods, but certainly the map opened the way for this kind of interpretation. The mapping of travel ephemera seems in many respects to be a highly democratic project. Though there are big players involved, much is produced of the work of smaller companies, local entrepreneurs, and local agencies, artists, job printers, and amateur cartographers. But these last examples show that the sources and supporters of this mapping is largely local elites with agendas and interests of their own to pursue. Thank you very much.
Jim, thank you very much for a very thorough presentation. It brings back a lot of memories for me as my family traveled in the 1950s and 60s, particularly when you had the map of Rock City. It made me curious. Did you find any maps for south of the border or all the Stuckies throughout the Southeast?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, you might be not surprise you that I've collected these things for a very long time, but and many of these are now in the Newberry. But yeah, they're this whole phenomenon and of this roadside advertising is usually accompanied by maps that are very much directed at designed to direct people who are traveling from hundreds of miles away to these particular locations, or indeed to partake in particular roadside businesses such as Stuckies, and to know where their locations, where the next Stuckies and the pecan divinity are to be found.
Okay, let's take a look at a few more questions. One from Andrew Reynolds. You mentioned a map design with a slant toward businessmen and how industrially prolific an area was. I'm surprised we don't see more of that sort of thing.
Yeah. I would say, first of all, that I haven't looked for as many examples as I should, but it's a reasonably common phenomenon. But I think the case for businesses, I think there are more dollars in the discretionary traveler, directed towards the discretionary traveler, which is the tourist, so I would be surprised if the number of maps that have this particular business orientation would be something like 5% of the total in that particular genre. But that's a good point. But it's partly my own failure to unearth more examples that we actually have.
Okay, a question from Curtis Wright. How does the scholarly value of ephemeral maps change? In addition to transportation history, these items capture valuable information on small business economy, geographic features, recreation, and material culture. Where are the future areas of study for the 20th century travel maps?
Yeah, well, I think perhaps in the last couple of examples, I pointed one direction and identified one direction of this. This is I mean it when I said this is very much the mapping of local elites, although in some cases these are very local, very localized communities. But I think one of the things I think one of the areas that we will be looking at, and we should be looking at, is very closely is the kinds of images of historically marginalized people that are perhaps not as mobile, or people that are on the move for reasons that don't have anything to do with tourism, and try to look beyond the sort of, I guess you'd say, for want of a better term, the sort of dime store Indian depiction of these things. There is a number of examples of maps of this type now being, for example, being published by Indian reservations, and I'm becoming a little more sensitive to this kind of thing. You probably all know, especially since the book, the movie, The Green Book, about these specialized guides for Negro motorists that are out there. There is kind of a counter mapping that runs against this. I think in a completely different vein is how is the culture, most of the examples we looked at is the digital culture, is our paper maps. How is the digital milieu in which tourism and other kinds of geographical information is promoted? How does that affect the publication of these kinds of ephemeral materials? At the moment, we still see a lot of these appearing, but I've found some examples, for example, of guided tours of battlefield sites that actually ask you to sign in with Q codes, to online resources about particular sites, or direct you to websites that the publishers of these maps have developed. Are we going to see we already do see the rough equivalent of this in many types of promotional sites that are handheld, but I think there's still in our cell phones. But I think there's still a utility for printed types of materials, and I think that would be another area to see how our transforming culture is going to change, and indeed how our sense of direction, and I mean that in the simplest possible way, is being affected by these digital aids we have to navigation. Are we going to have some illiteracy at the very fundamental level that will get in the way of people using these kinds of maps?
Okay, Wilbert Strove asks, When were the earliest travel maps made that were sponsored by businesses to encourage visitors?
That's a good question. It depends on what you mean by a traveler's map. The earliest examples of maps made for specific travelers that I know of date from the late 1850s. Colton, the firm of George J.H. Colton, were starting to produce customized travelers maps with that were promoting a specific hotel or business. You could say the county land ownership maps from this period as well, to the extent that they're promoting people that might be moving into a county, would be that of that sort. But as a large scale phenomenon, this dates to the 1870s, and it dates to the engagement of the railroads and to the publishers like Crowfoot and Rand McNally that were serving railroad travelers.
Okay, we're running over a good bit, but let's do one more question and then we'll draw the meeting to a close. From Vic Turner, other than the Green Book, were there any maps or brochures produced for Black travelers?
Yes, the Green Book is the most famous, but I've seen at least 4 different other types of publications, although they are fairly rare in the sense that they don't tend to survive in archives like the Newberry. We have one example of them, and by the way, regrettably, they're extremely expensive now. They're very collectible, not the least of which is because because of the notoriety of the movie, but also because there is a very large collectible market for African Americana that drives these things. They've been something that's been very popular among people in the African American community for a long time. But most notably, these are things that are published by by businesses that are African-owned businesses. As a general rule, you won't find these things published by oil companies. The big exception was Esso, which, by the way, had a very open attitude towards Black travelers for much of the 20th century. And this seems to have been carried through to their willingness to be participating as advertisers in these African-American publications.
Okay, before we bring this to a conclusion, Jim, could you say just a few words about the new exhibit that you're working on?
Sure. So I invite you all, when we all can go on the road again, to Chicago. I forget the exact dates, but opening in mid-February 2022 and staying open until mid-June. There's a new exhibition called Crossings, Mapping American Journeys. It is a collective a cross-section of travel maps and publications produced in the 19th and 20th century, meant to offer them as windows into the experiences of travelers in the what is the United States during this period, from the earliest migrants, travelers' guides to even to the age of air travel. And the distinctive thing about it is that it's going to be laid out like a map, something I'm working very hard to figure out how that will work in the exhibit space. But literally the north wall will be the northern border of the United States. The south wall of the gallery will be facing south, and so on. And the objects will be laid out along 4 major transcontinental crossings hence the term crossings, which, like the Erie Canal to the New York Thruway, often these pathways, whatever the technology, follow the same course of travel. And that's the conceit of the exhibition. Thank you for the ability to plug this, Ron. I'll add that this is planning for the exhibit is supported by the National Endowment for Humanities.
Okay, well, Jim, on behalf of all the map societies, I thank you for this presentation. I see there's still more questions. Hopefully we can print those out for you. You might be able to respond to them.
Sure. Anyone who does have questions, and I see that the number of participants is dwindling off rapidly, happy to have them. I'll put in the chat my email address, but I'll also say it out, ackermanj@newberry.org. Let me type it in. But you can also just find me from the Newberry's website, and I'd be happy to answer any and all questions about our collections and about, I'm sorry, I seem to be sending this privately to Lynn Carpenter, who must have said hello to me at some point, but okay, so that's failed, but so you can find me on the website, and I'll be happy to answer these questions.
Okay. Okay, we will send you a few little gifts. First of all, some greeting cards done by Cherry Blossom Creative here in Washington, D.C. They've done a map of or a set of cards for Chicago, as well as a cut line map of Chicago. So these you can add to your ephemera collection.
Thank you. May I just add in closing that it has been my lifelong dream to give a lecture wearing a tie, simultaneously wearing a tie and button-down shirt and gym shorts. And that dream has been realized tonight. I assure you, I am wearing gym shorts, not anything less than that. But
Want to stand up, Jim?
no, well, no, I don't want to give people any sort of ideas, but I am dressed decent. My mother would find me dressed decently. So rest assured, it's not X-rated here. Thank you all for your patience through a rather long presentation, and look forward to seeing you all in Chicago next year, I hope. Thank you, Ron. Thank you,
Yes.
John.